Sidney Crosby isn't just one of the greatest hockey players ever, he's also one of the most hated. Sure, he's got 3 Stanley Cups, 2 Olympic golds, MVP awards, scoring titles. The guy has it all. But to some NHL players, he's nothing more than a whiner, a diver, or even a dirty player. So I had to put together a list of the top players who hate Crosby. And just wait until you see the legendary names that can't stand him. Number 8, Ilya Kovalchuk. Kicking things off with Ilya Kovalchuk. Drafted first overall in 2001 by the Atlanta Thrashers, Kovalchuk was seen as one of the future faces of the league. But just a few years later, another young star entered the picture, Sidney Crosby. Dubbed the next one, Crosby was hyped as hockey's golden boy when he was drafted in 2005. It didn't take long for Kovalchuk to take issue with him. In a heated 2006 matchup between the Thrashers and Penguins, Crosby threw a questionable hit on Kovalchuk's fellow countryman and teammate Slava Kozlov. The hit earned Crosby a cross-checking penalty, but Kovalchuk wasn't about to let it slide. Later in the game, while Crosby was serving another penalty, Kovalchuk scored a stunning goal, and he made sure Sid the Kid knew about it, staring him down and pointing straight at him as if to say, "That's what you get." And if that wasn't enough proof that Kovalchuk isn't exactly Crosby's biggest fan, just take a look at his loyalty to Alex Ovechkin. Time and time again, Kovalchuk has publicly backed Ovi over Crosby, making it pretty clear where his allegiance lies. Safe to say, Sid won't be getting a Christmas card from Covey anytime soon. Number 7, Ryan Miller. But if Kovalchuk had a problem with Crosby because of his antics, this next guy's issue is much simpler. He just hates how good Sid the Kid is. Ryan Miller is widely regarded as one of the top U.S.-born goaltenders in NHL history. And during his 18-year career from 2002 to 2021, he and Sidney Crosby crossed paths a lot. And almost every time it ended the same way, with Miller picking the puck out of his net while Crosby celebrated another clutch goal. No matter the stage, no matter the stakes, Crosby always seemed to have Miller's number. See, back in the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, Miller was unreal during that tournament, making save after save and carrying Team USA all the way to the gold medal game. He was this close to capping off a dream run, but then in overtime, Crosby happened. A quick pass, a lightning-fast shot, and just like that, game over. Canada wins gold. Miller, the standout goalie of the entire tournament, was left stunned on the ice as Crosby basked in the glory of what would later be known as the Golden Goal. And that wasn't even the first time Sid crushed him. 2 years earlier at the 2008 Winter Classic, the NHL's first ever outdoor game, Miller had another shot at besting Crosby. The game went to a shootout, and who else but Crosby stepped up to take the final shot. He skated in, made his move, and buried the puck past Miller, securing the win for Pittsburgh, and once again stealing the spotlight. It wasn't just a couple of fluke moments either. This became a pattern. Whenever Miller was in the net, Crosby had a way of ruining his night. And it wasn't just that Crosby beat him, it was how he did it. The big moments, the clutch goals, the high-pressure situations, Crosby thrived in all of them. And Miller was often on the receiving end of his highlight reel plays. So if Miller holds a little extra resentment towards Sid, it's not hard to see why. Losing to the same guy over and over, especially when it matters the most, would get under anyone's skin. Number 6, Zdeno Chara. Some players hate Crosby for his skill, others hate him for his antics. But when it comes to Zdeno Chara, it's a little bit of both. Now, if there's one guy in the NHL you don't want to get on the wrong side of, it's Zdeno Chara. Standing at a staggering 6 feet 9 inches and weighing in at around 250 pounds, Chara is an absolute monster on the ice. He's not just big, he's mean, he's physical, and he's one of the most dominant defensemen the game's ever seen. A longtime captain of the Boston Bruins and a Stanley Cup champion, Chara built his reputation on shutting down the league's best players, and naturally that included Sidney Crosby. See, Crosby's known for his competitive fire, but sometimes that fire turns into frustration. When things don't go his way, he has a habit of letting his emotions get the best of him, and when you're up against Chara, frustration is almost guaranteed. The man is a nightmare for any forward, long reach, insane strength, and a punishing physical style that makes life miserable for anyone trying to get past him. The bad blood between these two is played out in several heated moments, especially during the playoffs when tensions are at their peak. But one of their most infamous run-ins came in 2013 during the Eastern Conference Finals between the Penguins and Bruins. Pittsburgh was getting completely shut down, and Crosby was having a rough series. His frustration boiled over, and in a rare moment of defiance, he shoved Chara. Now let's be real. Crosby pushing Chara's like a fly trying to move a brick wall. Chara barely budged, but the moment was tense. The towering Bruins captain looked down at Crosby, and for a second, it seemed like things were about to get ugly. But Crosby knew exactly what he was doing. He picked his spot perfectly, knowing full well that the officials weren't about to let Chara get his hands on him. Instead, Crosby used the moment to get in Chara's face, chirping at him, fully aware that the refs would step in before things escalated. Chara, to his credit, didn't take the bait, at least not at that moment. But make no mistake, he didn't forget. You don't mess with a guy like Chara without consequences. And you can bet that the next time they met, Chara made sure Crosby felt his presence every time he stepped on the ice. At the end of the day, these two will never be friends. Crosby may have been one of the most skilled players in the league, but Chara was one of the toughest, and their clashes were inevitable. And if you ask Chara, he probably still hasn't forgotten the day Crosby had the audacity to shove him. Number 5, Ryan O'Reilly. But if you thought Crosby's shove on Chara was bad, just wait until you see what Sid the Kid did to this next guy. Now, Ryan O'Reilly is the definition of a workhorse. He's not the flashiest guy on the ice, not the biggest or most physically imposing, but he's built his career on sheer effort, elite two-way play, and an unrelenting drive to outwork everyone. A former Selke Trophy winner, a Stanley Cup champion, and a Conn Smythe recipient, O'Reilly's earned his reputation as one of the league's best defensive forwards. He's the guy teams rely on to shut down elite scorers, win crucial faceoffs, and lead by example. He plays the game hard, but fair. No shortcuts, just pure grit and determination. And that's exactly why what Sidney Crosby did to him didn't sit well with him. See, this wasn't just another intense battle between two competitors. This wasn't a hard but clean hit, a tough play in the corners, or even a heated exchange of words. No, this was dirty, plain and simple. It happened during a game between O'Reilly's Buffalo Sabres and Crosby's Penguins. The two had already been going at it all night, battling in the face-off circle, trading checks, and playing the kind of physical, high-intensity hockey you expect from a guy like O'Reilly. But then, in a moment that caught everyone off guard, Crosby took things way too far. With the puck out of reach and no real play to be made, Crosby suddenly swung his stick right between O'Reilly's legs. And this wasn't just some accidental tap, this was deliberate. A full-force slash to the worst possible spot. O'Reilly immediately crumbled in pain, dropping to the ice as he clutched at himself with his face showing agony. Even the commentators were stunned. This wasn't the kind of thing you expect from the face of the NHL. Now, hockey's a rough game. Players slash, cross-check, and throw punches all the time, but there are certain lines you just don't cross. Certain unwritten rules that even the most aggressive players respect. And a direct stick swing to the groin? That's about as low as it gets. But what made this even worse? Crosby faced no consequences. No penalty, no fine, no suspension. Nothing. It was as if it never even happened. For a guy like O'Reilly, who built his career on doing things the right way, that had to sting just as much as the cheap shot itself. Imagine putting in years of hard work, playing the game with integrity, only to watch someone get away with something so blatant just because of who they are. And that's the thing. The NHL has long been accused of protecting its star players, of letting certain guys off the hook for things that would get anyone else in trouble. And if there was ever a case that proved that point, this was it. Sure, Crosby later apologized, but let's be honest, an apology doesn't erase the fact that he got away with it. So if O'Reilly holds a little extra hate for Sid the Kid, can you really blame him? Losing to the same guy over and over is one thing, but getting hit where it hurts literally and watching the guy who did it skate away without any repercussions, that's enough to make anyone hate their opponent just a little bit more. Number 4, PK Subban. Now, rivalries in hockey are inevitable. Some are born out of hard-fought battles, others out of personal clashes. But when a player feels like another cost him a shot at hockey's ultimate prize, the Stanley Cup, that resentment doesn't just fade away, it lingers, festers, and sometimes turns into outright hate. And that's exactly how PK Subban feels about Sidney Crosby. The 2017 Stanley Cup Finals between the Nashville Predators and the Pittsburgh Penguins had everything: speed, skill, physicality, and drama. It was a war between two teams desperate to etch their names into hockey history. But amidst all the highlight reel goals and bone-crushing hits, an unexpected off-ice controversy stole the spotlight. It all started after Game 3. The Predators had just secured a crucial win over Pittsburgh, and tensions were running high. Then, in the post-game interviews, PK Subban dropped a bombshell, claiming Crosby told him his breath stank. Always one for the showmanship, Subban didn't let it slide. He fired back with a now iconic response: "I use Listerine before every game, so my breath is always minty fresh." The media ran with it, but there was one person who didn't find it funny: Sidney Crosby. He immediately denied ever saying it, calling Subban's claim completely fabricated, suggesting that the defenseman was just looking for attention. Subban, never one to back down from a good troll, took it a step further. When he arrived for Game 4, he made sure to carry multiple oversized bottles of Listerine, making a grand spectacle of the whole thing. It was a playful, almost harmless feud until things turned nasty. Game 5, series tied 2-2. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Every single play mattered. Every shift carried the weight of a potential championship. The Penguins jumped out to an early lead, but the Predators weren't backing down. The intensity was suffocating, and frustration was beginning to boil over. Then it happened. Subban and Crosby got tangled up near the boards, battling for position. They crashed to the ice in what seemed like a routine scuffle, but instead of getting up, Crosby stayed on top of Subban and did something shocking. He grabbed Subban's head and started slamming it into the ice, over and over again. This wasn't just a hard shove or a bit of rough play. This was deliberate and calculated, yet somehow the referees let it slide. No whistle, no penalty, no review, nothing. It was as if Crosby had a shield of protection around him, an invisible force field that kept him immune from consequences. Meanwhile, Subban, one of the league's most dynamic defensemen, was left humiliated. To make matters worse, the Penguins didn't just win that game, they annihilated the Predators in a 6-0 blowout, pushing Nashville to the brink of elimination. In the next game, Pittsburgh closed out the series, lifting the Stanley Cup, while Subban and his teammates watched in bitter disappointment. For Subban, it wasn't just a loss, it was personal. He'd been mocked, manhandled, and ultimately left empty-handed, while Crosby skated off with yet another championship. And to this day, if PK Subban and Sidney Crosby ever find themselves in the same bar, one thing's certain: Crosby won't be getting a drink from Subban. Number 3, Alex Ovechkin. And speaking of rivalries, some rivalries define eras. They shape the landscape of a sport, fueling debates, breaking records, and creating unforgettable moments. And in hockey, few rivalries have been as iconic or as personal as Sidney Crosby versus Alex Ovechkin. For nearly 2 decades, these two superstars have been at the heart of the Washington Capitals-Pittsburgh Penguins feud, a battle that's dominated headlines, fueled heated debates, and captivated fans around the world. It's a rivalry that transcends individual talent. It's bigger than just two men. It's about legacy, about greatness, about two titans pushing each other to their absolute limits, much like Messi and Ronaldo in soccer. Every year, every game, every goal, they were always compared. They were the main event, the stars who headlined opening nights, dominated promotional graphics, and delivered the moments fans would never forget. Both were generational talents, and from the very start, the battle lines were drawn. The Capitals-Penguins rivalry was already fierce, but when these two entered the league, it reached another level. Their personal war spilled over to their teammates, igniting an all-out arms race between the franchises. It wasn't just about individual accolades, it was about winning. And in those early years, the one thing neither man could afford was to let the other get ahead. The peak of their clash came in the 2008-09 season. Both players were in their absolute prime, leading the NHL in scoring and dazzling fans every night. That year, Ovechkin finished second in the league in points, while Crosby placed third, setting up a collision course in the playoffs that almost felt scripted. The Eastern Conference semifinals, Washington versus Pittsburgh, Ovechkin versus Crosby. It was a battle for supremacy, a series destined to be remembered. and Game 2 gave us one of the greatest duels in NHL history. Ovechkin and Crosby both took over, putting on a masterclass in offensive brilliance. 1 goal, 2 goals, 3 goals, both men recorded hat tricks in a thrilling high-stakes showdown. It was the kind of game that perfectly encapsulated their rivalry. 2 absolute superstars refusing to back down, matching each other blow for blow. But amidst the fireworks, Crosby had a moment of uncharacteristic frustration. As the Washington crowd erupted, showering the ice with hats in celebration of Ovechkin's historic night, Crosby, visibly irritated, skated over to the referee and asked the officials to stop the hats from being thrown onto the ice. It was a strange move, an almost petty request from a player who had already built a reputation as one of the league's fiercest competitors. To many, it wasn't just about the hats, it was about Crosby's frustration, his unwillingness to accept that, on that night, Ovechkin had stolen the show. But in the end, it didn't matter. Despite the Capitals taking a 2-0 series lead, Pittsburgh clawed back, winning 2 games in Washington before ultimately sealing the series in a dominant Game 7 performance. Crosby had won the battle, and to twist the knife even deeper, the Penguins went on to capture the Stanley Cup, defeating the Detroit Red Wings in a dramatic finals rematch. For Ovechkin, it was another devastating chapter in his career, a reminder that despite all the goals and all the personal accolades, Crosby was still the one lifting the cup, and that stung. Over time, as age and injuries took their toll, the intensity of their rivalry began to fade. Ovechkin's production slowed, Crosby battled through health issues, and the once fiery war between them became more of a quiet, lingering tension rather than an all-out battle. But make no mistake, this rivalry still matters, even after all these years, after all the goals, the trophies, and the countless head-to-head battles. Whenever Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin step onto the same ice, the fire reignites. Because some rivalries truly never die. Number 2, Henrik Lundqvist. But as crazy as the Ovechkin-Crosby rivalry was, for our next guy, Henrik Lundqvist, one of the most dominant goaltenders of his era, his ultimate villain was often Sidney Crosby. Lundqvist wasn't just a goalie, he was the king, the backbone of the New York Rangers, a franchise icon, and one of the most technically gifted netminders the NHL had ever seen. For 15 years, he carried the Rangers, turning in world-class performance night after night, cementing himself as one of the best to ever do it. But even the greatest goalies have their nightmares, and for Lundqvist, few players haunted him quite like Sidney Crosby. Because playing in the same division meant that these two faced off a lot, and time after time, Crosby and his Penguins seemed to get the better of Lundqvist. Whether it was regular season matchups, brutal playoff battles, or even international showdowns, Crosby always found a way to get the better of the king, and that didn't sit well with Lundqvist. The bad blood between them had been brewing for years, but things really boiled over in the 2014 NHL playoffs. It was a high-stakes series between 2 bitter division rivals, and as always, tensions were sky high. And during one particularly heated moment, a scrum broke out near the Rangers' net. Players were shoving, tempers were flaring, and right in the middle of it all was Sidney Crosby, his usual pest-like self, chirping, poking, and getting under everyone's skin. Lundqvist had seen enough, and so in one of the pettiest yet most hilarious moments in playoff history, he casually grabbed his water bottle and sprayed Crosby directly in the face. It was subtle, it was effortless, it was the perfect act of passive-aggressive revenge. Crosby, completely caught off guard, flinched as the water splashed into his face. The refs missed it, the fans loved it, and Lundqvist, he didn't even flinch. He just stood there, mask in hand, like he hadn't just baptized one of the league's biggest superstars in front of millions. Of course, the NHL took notice, and Lundqvist was fined $5,000 for the stunt. But let's be honest, something tells me the satisfaction of drenching Crosby at that moment was worth every single penny. And this wasn't just about one petty act of revenge. The truth is, Lundqvist had been battling Crosby for years, and most of the time it didn't go his way. Even outside the NHL, Crosby had found ways to crush Lundqvist's dreams. Take the 2014 Winter Olympics, for example. Sweden and Canada met in the gold medal game, with Lundqvist standing tall in the net for the Swedes. This was his moment, his chance to add an Olympic gold medal to his legendary resume. But once again, Crosby and Canada shut the door on him. With Lundqvist guarding Sweden's net, Crosby led Team Canada to a dominating 3-0 victory, sealing yet another heartbreaking defeat for the King at Crosby's hands. So if there ever was a moment for Lundqvist to send just a little message back to Crosby, that playoff water bottle incident was it. And to this day, if you ask Henrik Lundqvist how he feels about Sidney Crosby, something tells me there won't be any warm or fond memories. Just a lingering bitterness from years of battles, heartbreaks, and frustration. Number 1, Marc Methot. But with that said, every sport has its villains. Those players who, intentionally or not, leave a trail of bruised egos, shattered hopes, and in this case, nearly severed fingers. And for Marc Methot, a former NHL defenseman known for his physical, no-nonsense style of play, that villain was Sidney Crosby. Methot spent most of his career as a dependable, hard-hitting defenseman, playing key roles with the Columbus Blue Jackets and, most notably, the Ottawa Senators. He wasn't the flashiest guy on the ice, but he was a defensive anchor, a guy who made life miserable for opposing forwards, and no one made his life more miserable than Sidney Crosby. The tension between the two erupted in brutal fashion during the 2016-17 season in a moment that still haunts Methot to this day. During a matchup between the Senators and the Penguins, Crosby delivered a vicious slash to Methot's hand, one that almost took off the tip of his finger. The aftermath was gruesome. Methot skated off the ice, his glove concealing a horrifying injury. The tip of his pinky was crushed, nearly hanging off, and required immediate medical attention. Trainers had to carefully stitch the shattered remains of his finger back together. By NHL rules, this should have been a clear-cut major penalty, a blatant slash that resulted in a serious injury, but the referees let Crosby walk away without so much as a minor penalty. No call, no ejection, nothing. And when the league didn't step in to punish him either, the frustration from Methot and the entire Ottawa fan base hit an all-time high. Think about it. If an opposing player nearly chops off part of your finger and gets away with it like nothing ever happened, how could you not hold a grudge? Years later, Methot still wasn't over it. In 2021, after watching Crosby deliver a questionable hit on Washington Capitals defenseman Martin Fehervary, Methot took to social media and flat-out demanded that Crosby be suspended for at least 10 games. His reasoning? He'd seen Crosby get away with too much for too long. The lingering resentment from that fateful slash was still fresh in his mind, and it was clear. Marc Methot had never forgiven Sidney Crosby. There you have it, 8 hockey players who aren't exactly fans of Sid the Kid. If you had a blast watching this, smash that like button and show some love. And hey, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out on our wildest content. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these players do you think hates Crosby the most? Or did we miss someone who should be on this list? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.